Welcome to the Beckoning Bookshelf. I'm your host, Jeffrey Ashcraft. This is a story I've wanted for a really long time, and I finally have a copy. Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke, the first story. By the way, can we just talk about just how massive this book is? It's huge. I was so surprised at the size when I got it. It's massive. Diameter-wise, this might be the biggest book I own. Yeah. So, well, like I said, this is a story by Hayao Miyazaki, and it was first published in Japan in 1983. It wouldn't be published in the United States until 2014. Now, you may be thinking, oh, Princess Mononoke, I know that movie. This does not look like that movie. No, they look wildly different. Yeah, yep. They're very different, but this is where the story that we now have in the film, this is where that story started. And it's all very interesting, so let's talk about it. Let's set the stage first. So, it's not going in there. There we go. It's a massive book. So, the Castle of Cagliostro, Miyazaki's directorial debut, just released in 1979. And Telecom Animation Film, the animation studio that Miyazaki was associated with at the time, they currently didn't have any particular work for him. So Miyazaki had some free time. So he started to work on his own projects, one of which was Princess Mononoke. He drew sketches for the story in 1980. Now, while he was working on this, he was working on a few other projects as well, including Shuna's Journey and My Neighbor Totoro. He would also soon start work on Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which would be serialized in a manga in 1982 and be released as a film in 1984 in Japan. So, what's the book about? Well, it's kind of like a Beauty and the Beast story, but set in feudal Japan. So yeah, like I said, a little bit different. The youngest daughter of a samurai lord is given to a Mononoke as a bride. Now, a Mononoke is a cat-like yokai that lives in the forest. So that's practically what the story's about. It's not really all that long. It's a picture book. Well, when Miyazaki submitted this story for production, apparently he was told it was too dark and the story got rejected, which I find kind of funny, which we'll talk about that later. But, Miyazaki admitted defeat and he withdrew the submission along with the submission of My Neighbor Totoro, which he had submitted at the same time. Now, regardless of it being, rejected at the time, it was published in 1983 as a picture book along with Shuna's Journey. But that's all that would happen to it for a long, long time. It would just kind of mull about in Miyazaki's brain for about 10 years. Because he really wanted to do a period piece in feudal Japan, a piece that took place in feudal Japan, which Princess Mononoke does. However, in that time, he began to also see some problems with his story, particularly in the fact that it was too simple, that everything worked out too easily, that it was far too fairy tale-like. It was too much of a fairy tale, and he wanted something more genuine, more real. So, and this is how Miyazaki describes it, after a harsh and magnificent pilgrimage, he started working on the story once again. And eventually, it would become the film that we know today, that was released in 1997 in Japan. And we wouldn't get it in the US until 1999. So that's the story of Princess Mononoke, the first story. That's why it's called the first story. It's because it's such a wildly different story than the film we eventually got. So let's talk about the book itself. So, like I said, this book is massive. It's huge. And that's good and bad. The good part is the illustrations are all massive inside the book. They're all plenty big. Because if you take a look, they're all really big. You also kind of see the problem with the book, too, is it's so huge that it's really kind of hard to to read while you're holding it. And to just flip through the pages. You really want to have this on a table or on the floor while you're reading it, because just holding it and just opening it is just kind of difficult. Now, when it comes to the illustrations, well, let's talk about the story first. The story is well done. It's a good story. It's very simple. It is, as Miyazaki described it, a fairy tale. Very short, very simple, perfect for a children's picture book. And it's an interesting story in and of itself. It's still somewhat deep while being simple at the same time. Now, illustration-wise, the illustration, it's clearly art by Hayao Miyazaki. And that's great. That's awesome. But if you're expecting completed, finely polished artwork, you're going to be surprised about what's in this book. All the illustrations in this book are at varying stages of completion. Well, they're at various stages of completion, and some of which are more completed than others. But they are all unfinished and all unpolished. So, for example, this cover art here, this is probably the most polished well, it's an example of one of the most polished illustrations in the book. That just goes to show just how unfinished some of the illustrations are. It goes from this type of polish and finishing work to just what looked like a random sketch that literally received no work afterwards after the sketch was initially made. And the coloring is also kind of everywhere, like completion-wise. Some, illustrations are fully colored. Others, there's just color missing. Like, it's not intended that characters are just colorless. You clearly see that just nothing was colored, that they were just left blank. And it's just a good reminder that this book was never meant to be a full story. What we're reading here is practically what Miyazaki submitted to get the story into full production. So that's what we're seeing. So what's here was never polished. This is what was polished, which is kind of fascinating. Polishing this story gets you this. Wow, it's wildly different. Anyways, so the question is, would this book succeed if it wasn't Hayao Miyazaki? I don't think so. I think the story is good enough, but with the artwork being unpolished and uncompleted, the only reason why people get it is because it's Hayao Miyazaki. That's why I got it, that it's cool, it's great. It's fascinating to also see where this story started. That's really it. The only reason why this book does well is because it's Hayao Miyazaki. If it was anybody else, if it was some unknown artist, no one would really care. So, I also briefly want to talk about the fascinating idea that this was apparently too dark. And that's Miyazaki's words. He doesn't describe who said it was too dark, but apparently it was too dark and rejected for that. But then you look at the finished film. I mean, it's kind of like Miyazaki was somewhat resentful that this was said as too dark, and so he just decided, well, fine, I'll make an even darker story. I mean, Princess Mononoke was viewed as so violent that back in the 90s, when Disney was distributing the Ghibli films, all the Ghibli films from Disney, particularly the Miyazaki ones, have the Disney logo and the Disney name on the DVD, but Princess Mononoke doesn't, because they gave it to their Miramax branch, their Miramax subsidiary, where they typically send more mature films, because Disney didn't want to damage their family-friendly name. So more mature films like Princess Mononoke were sent to subsidiaries. That's why if you have the Studio Ghibli DVD collection from the 90s, they're all going to say Disney except for Princess Mononoke, which says Miramax, because it was viewed as too mature and violent to be a family-friendly story. While the original story was very family-friendly. This is not near as dark as this is. So I thought that was kind of funny. Now, there are clear connections between the first story and the film we eventually got, but you kind of got to dig for them because the changes were just vast. But there are other clearer connections to other of Miyazaki's works. For example, the Mononoke, he kind of looks like Totoro, like in his body shape and his mannerisms and stuff like that. He also clearly looks like the cat bus from My Neighbor Totoro, like his face, his eyes, his fur. He looks like the cat bus. There's also connections to Porco Rosso in the origins of the Mononoke, which I won't go into details there for spoilers, but if you've seen the film, you probably know what I'm talking about. And this is also kind of a fun, I have no idea if these two things are connected, but the princess's clothes, you can see it's kind of green there. Well, in some of the illustrations, her clothes have similar colors and style to Chihiro's shirt in Spirited Away. No idea if those are connected, seriously, but I thought that was kind of cool. Anyways, that is all I have for you today. Have you read Princess Mononoke's The First Story? And if you have, what do you think? Would you like to see this as an actual, like, fleshed out feature film? Or do you prefer Princess Mononoke film that we actually got? By the way, have you seen Princess Mononoke? Like the movie, and what do you think? Is it your favorite Miyazaki film? Is it your least favorite Miyazaki film? Because out of all the films from Miyazaki, this one might be the most mature. So, anyways, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for being here. Thank you always for being here. You are amazing. And go find yourself a good book.